Deputy Pauline Tullies.
Minister, can you please outline the position regarding the Education of Persons with Special Education Needs Act 2004, more commonly referred to as the EPSEN Act, which has never been fully commenced despite being a central strand of the National Disability Strategy? So children with disabilities and learning needs cannot access assessments with a right of appeal, or individual education plans have not been placed on a statutory basis. So do you and your department have any plans to fully commence the Act?
Thank you, Deputy, for your question. A number of sections of the EPSEN Act, the Education for Persons with Special Needs, have been commenced. And the commenced provisions include those establishing the National Council for Special Education, the NCSE, and those providing for an inclusive approach to the education of children with special educational needs. And the remaining sections of the Act, as you mentioned, have not yet been commenced. However, the Government has continued to invest in the area of special education support. And next year, the Department will invest approximately £2 billion in the area of special education needs. That's a fifth of the Department's budget and up over 50% since 2011. And since EPSEN was acted, the Department's policy on supporting children with SEN has changed and evolved on foot of evidence-based policy advice from the NCSE, which takes account of international perspectives. And significantly, the focus of special needs education provision has changed from a model that is diagnosis-led to one which is driven by the needs of the child. And this is a substantially different view to the one that underlies the EPSEN Act. The levels of investment by government in special education has increased to facilitate the underlying reforms required to implement and embed the needs-based approach. And this change is evidenced by the introduction of new allocation models for special education teachers and indeed special needs assistants. And one of my key objectives as Minister for Special Education, and you may recall, Deputy, that I recently published my action priorities for the next few years, one of which is to carry out a review of the Education of Persons with Special Education Needs Act. And this review will take into account the extent of additional investment made in special education services since 2004 and the move, as I said, towards a needs-based approach. And I will also work with colleagues in government to ensure a joined-up approach and a continuum of support for children with SEN.
Thank you, Minister Madigan. Deputy Tully.
Thank you, Minister. As you mentioned, there are some of the aspects of the Act were commenced, such as the establishment of the NCSE. And I know they prepared an implementation report way back in 2006, which set out a sequence in which the remaining revisions of the Act should be commenced, and estimated a level of investment at that time for implementation. And it was planned to implement it by 2010, but a decision was taken in 2008 to suspend the implementation, and I'm not sure exactly why that was, whether it was to do with the level of investment that was required. I know an independent appeals element had been established. There was a Special Education Appeals Board, but when the term of the inaugural board ended, no new board was formed. It just seemed to end, and there were elements there that were supposed to be commenced and didn't. And I know you've said there's a level of investment and some things have changed, and there's been much speculation around when the Act will be fully implemented, and it will be called by some representative groups on behalf of children with special needs that this Act should be fully commenced. So I'm just wondering, will the government publish a plan then to say whether they're going to actually implement the rest of the EPSEN Act or put something else in its place, or what exactly are the plans?
Thank you, Deputy Minister.
Thank you, Deputy. As you appreciate, I've only recently published my action priorities, and as I said, one of those priorities is to conduct a review of the EPSEN Act in its entirety. And the premise of that really is, as I said, is because we're moving away since 2004, which is quite 16 years since it was originally enacted. We've moved quite substantially away from this diagnosis-led model to a needs-based model. And also, one of the issues why it hadn't been commenced, from my understanding, is from a cost perspective. What the NCSE, I think, and the department had estimated is that over a period of years it would have cost about €235 million per annum to implement and to commence all of the priorities or the parts of the Act that haven't yet been commenced. I mean, the criteria that I will be using, so I'll be reviewing the areas where SEN policy has evolved since the EPSEN, and how best to progress the aspects of the EPSEN Act that, on a non-statutory basis as well. And I also, just to finish, Cancora, I'll be looking at new challenges in the area of SEN that may have arisen since then.
Deputy Tully, and a supplementary then from Deputy O'Leary.
It's just, I suppose, failure to implement the EPSEN Act fully, or something similar in its place, will run contrary to the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. Because under Article 24 of the Convention, the Government is obliged to ensure that children with a disability are not excluded from the general education system on the basis of disability. Like, we need to provide a more inclusive society in all aspects of our life, which includes our education. And I mean, the new Oireachtas Committee on Disability Matters established last month, it has the very important role of overseeing the full implementation of the UNCPRD. But recently at a meeting of the committee, when they asked a question about the EPSEN Act, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission replied they did not feel the Act was fit for purpose and was outdated, but the National Disability Authority stated it should be implemented and needs to be implemented in order to fulfil our role under the UN Convention. So I'm just wondering, you know, which one is correct there. I would presume the provisions within the Act will need to be updated to reflect, as you said, 16 years have passed since it was introduced. But I mean, where it's practical, I think we need to integrate children into a mainstream school. It doesn't suit all children, we know that, but where it does and where they choose to, we need to ensure that they have the support to allow them to access mainstream education.
Deputy O'Leary.
Minister, just two things in relation to things the way that they're happening just at the minute. The first is in relation to the new modification of SNAs, and you know, my experience is that it is where schools experience a sudden relative increase in the number of needs in a classroom, that the model is not responsive enough to them. Previously was the case. If you had a child with autism join your class, you'd be guaranteed they'd have an SNA. That doesn't seem to be the case at this point in time. And add to that, just as an aside, like, I mean, the fact that there is still a bias against girls in the allocation of SNAs and special education teachers, I've never understood it, still don't understand it, still don't understand the basis for it, and you might consider that. But the other point is, and you reference, I suppose, some of the changes that may be coming with progressing disability and the teams in relation to that. A significant concern of special schools is that they will lose their multidisciplinary teams. Can you give a commitment that that won't be happening as progressing disability is expanded throughout the country?
So, just to address Deputy Tully's, when I say that I'm going to conduct a review of the EPSEN Act, I'll be conducting a review of it in its entirety, even the parts that have been commenced. But I still think that Section 2 of the EPSEN Act, when you're talking about that inclusive education, still stands. You know, a child with special education needs shall be educated in an inclusive environment with children who do not have such needs, unless the nature or degree of those needs is such that to do so would be inconsistent with A, the best interests of the child, and B, the effective provision of education for children with whom the child is to be educated. And to me, that sums it up in a nutshell in relation to special education in general, and I'll be using that as a premise for conducting all of my review. Just briefly, Deputy, I think you have a question on SNAs to come, and I'm not 100% sure, but I'll check out the bias in relation to girls. I can check that out for you. With SNAs, it's always open to school to engage with the exception review process if they feel that they haven't got sufficient allocation of SNAs. And obviously they were frozen for this year, so there was no impact because of COVID. And one of the things that I ensured in this budget with an amount of 14.7 million was that we would immediately replace any SNA for whatever reason would be absent.